Hello, my name is Cyrus Ware, and I'm joining you from Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I'm doing an artist residency for the month of May. I am here today to talk to you a little bit about a creative approach to talking about healthy sexualities and relationships. And I specifically want to tell you about a project that I was involved in called Shift Change that took place in 2008, right at the precipice, right at the crux of a massive change in Ontario when sex reassignment surgery was relisted under OHIP. So, sex reassignment surgery, the surgery that a lot of us trans people access, had been covered under OHIP until my Caris and then had been delisted in 1998. And after 10 years, a full decade of activism and organizing by trans activists in Toronto and all across the province, it was relisted under OHIP's list of things that it covers in 2008. And I was working with a group of young people through the Art Gallery of Ontario called the Art Gallery of Ontario Youth Council. They were a group of about 18 people made up between the ages of 14 and 25, and they worked together for a year to create large-scale projects of their own design, working with collaborations with artists, contemporary artists who were working in the city. And that particular year, when I was asking them what kind of projects they wanted to work on, what were the social issues that they wanted to tackle, what were the things that they wanted to approach in their creative practice, they all unanimously wanted to talk about this relisting of sex reassignment surgery under OHIP. And part of that was because there was more than one trans person in the group, and so there was more of a dialogue and a discussion about that as a sort of a current event and a topic. But also, I think that this was a generation that was right at the point when that trans bubble was sort of expanding, pre-Laverne Cox, but post a lot of advancements in trans health and trans history and activism, and there was just a general interest in tackling this. And the way that they decided to do that was by coming up with this concept of change. So trying to get the public on board with this idea that this was a wonderful thing that had changed with our legislation and that this was now covered by OHIP. And so what they decided to do was create this project called Shift Change that was a series of life-scale photographic representations demonstrating a specific change or transition to try to get the general public to see that they themselves also went through many changes in their day-to-day life, and that why was the change that trans people were choosing to make so surprising when we all were going through changes, minute changes and large-scale changes throughout our days every single day. So they created these life-size photographic installations, each demonstrating a specific change or transition. And they put them up all over the city. So the youth council partnered with Transfusion Crew out of Supporting Our Youth, and together they came up with this idea of a series of images of people moving from one to another thing. I'll show you in some of these images. And they put them up all over the city. And as such, Shift Change spread virally throughout the city, this beautiful message that specifically talked about sexuality, that talked about trans identity, and that talked about the need for us to embrace change. So we worked with an artist named Dan Bergeron, who's well known for doing large-scale wheat paste, or paste-ups, as they call them in graffiti tradition, all around the city. And he, at the time, had just come off of doing a large-scale campaign for Vespa and had these Vespa head characters all over the city. And he said, what would happen if instead we had trans people all over the city, pasted up all over buildings? And so he really encouraged the council to consider their work as proposals, to engage the viewer, to consider, the possibility of change. So the kinds of images that they had that showed a transition or change were things like a Black woman straightening her hair and really thinking about the implications of Black women being encouraged to straighten their hair as a sort of a deep-rooted anti-Blackness that was at play, for example, in some of their school systems where, just up until very recently, Black students have been sent home for wearing their hair natural. So in 2008, this was definitely the case. They asked questions like, what does it mean to exist in a gendered world and be genderless and be gender free or gender gifted or gender liberated? What does it mean to want to alter your body or to change your body for a variety of different reasons, not only in relation to trans identity? And so these were the provocations that they put up there. They had a series of about 8 different transitions that they showed. One, somebody who was getting prepared for plastic surgery. One, a black woman who was straightening her hair. One, a white cis man shaving a beard. One, a burlesque performer who is a plus size model putting on a corset and sort of going from not having a corset on to having a corset on, a trans person binding their chest, and then an image that they called Gender Supernova, which featured a drag performer getting dressed into drag on one side and getting dressed in the feminine clothes that they wore to go to work. And this was sort of their way of having a variety of everyday transitions, everyday changes that sort of happened in people's daily lives and putting them on display on par as part of this larger conversation about the need for access to change and transition for trans people. So Shift Change was a really great example of how artists and young people can work together to create public art that really puts the conversation of healthy sexuality on a public scale, in a public forum, in a public dialogue. Dan Bergeron, talking later about his work with the council, said this, and I quote, "The role of youth in the arts community, at least in the terms of the arts that I'm interested in, is multifaceted. For one, they are great critics, and their interest in underground subcultures. Of course, because of their age, they are less tainted by life's hardships. Because everything is new and exciting, they bring an enthusiasm that is unbridled, unrivaled, and invigorating. For me, this enthusiasm helps me to create more work and to try to examine ways in which I can engage in an audience that is very receptive," end quote. So working with the council, he really found, this way of anything being possible, their way of working where they really were invigorated by this topic and anything was possible. Putting up, hundreds of images of trans people and people going through transition all over the city of Toronto, no problem. And it really inspired his own practice to be more positive and sort of hopeful about, the way that he sort of went about his work. So Shift Change is just but one example of the projects that I've done with youth around the topic of healthy sexualities. I'm happy to say that the gallery really supported this project and funded this project. And it's not every day that a mainstream gallery would even be interested necessarily in tackling trans issues. But in their support of youth and in support of youth programming, they were really engaged in this project as well and helped support us to put it out all over the city. So that's one example. I think that the arts are an amazing way of opening up a dialogue for all of the people who walked by, and you'll see some images here of people walking by. For all of the people who walked by, the images of Shift Change all over the city, and then had ensuing conversations when they got to their destination. Hey, I just saw this really random thing on the. It opened up the dialogue for the general public in a way that I think was ultimately very, very useful. And as a trans person, I think it really was a turning point in the city that to have this unprecedented show of support for the legislation, for the change in the OHIP, and for trans people. The images that we put up around the city, when we were done the installation citywide, we ended up putting them on the construction hoarding around the AGO. The gallery was undergoing a transformation at that point itself, actually changing from an old building to a new building. And so we use that as well as a fodder to sort of talk about the only constant is change. Everything is going through a change. And that transitioning is a wonderful and beautiful thing. So we had these images that said the only thing is constant is change over and over and over again in text. And then on top of that, we had images, again, of the people straightening their hair or binding their chest. And that surrounded this art gallery for months. This is the largest art gallery in the country, surrounded by images of trans people enveloping it in sort of a warm hug for several months. Was really a beautiful thing. So I think that the arts can be an amazing, amazing conversation starter and an amazing, useful tool to be able to, talk about sexuality, because it can be a hard thing to bring up and to talk about. I think it's so essential, and I'm thrilled to have been able to work on this project and to share this project with you. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the conference.